Hello and most welcome to 1114, 1114 as my dear colleague Kalle mentioned here. And I will start up a new subject. I will look into two things simultaneously for the next, let's see here, that will be rather like 50 minutes. And I start with an article by Ostin B Moon from Sonoma State University. Nothing special, but it raises a very interesting subject. It is called From Heraclitus to Heisenberg, and I like to see it as From H to H. And it's called The Process of Evolution of Processes. In an alternative universe, all thought experiments could become reality. Schrödinger's possum would be alive. Leibniz's best of all worlds hypothesis would be a parody of Terry Southern's Candy, and Voltaire would have written the movie review. Panning it? Why? Because if there had been no Peloponnesian War, the Athenian Democrats would not have executed Socrates under the Patriot Act, prompting Plato to convert to republicanism in protest. But seriously, folks, this is what is really happening. This paper is both a short research paper and a thought experiment. As a short research paper, it will examine the writings of some major process philosophers. I will briefly discuss Sir Alfred North Whitehead, but the bulk of this paper will be about John Dewey and William James. And their views on epistemology and pragmatism, and how those views contribute to process philosophy. Because this paper is also a thought experiment, I will not only analyze the writings of those philosophers in the context of epistemology and process philosophy, but I will also examine my own process of examination in the context of epistemology and process philosophy. In conclusion, I will discuss how this paper is more than just a short research paper or thought experiment. It is also a process in its own right, a process that creates processes. Alright, I'll have to explain that first paragraph above for those readers who may not have followed my process. Process philosopher. Nicholas Rescher in Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines process as a sequentially structured sequence of successive stages or phrases. End of quote. Ignoring the clumsy redundancy and the heavily handed alliteration, that definition only describes the generic form of process. Obviously, time and change are the main ingredients in any recipe for a processed soup. All of life was formed out of a processed soup that used organic chemicals for spice. I don't think anyone had taken the trouble to count and catalogue how many different kinds of process there are, but the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy did mention that all the different kinds of processes can fall roughly into two categories. There are the teleological processes, those that are thought to contain some deterministic seed with a purpose. Then there are the random processes that just happen. But random process could, by some process, change into teleological process. And since a process does not have to be progressive, it can be degenerative. A teleological process can devolve into random process. Heraclitus, one of the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, gets the honor of being recognized as the first process philosopher in Western philosophy. If I was writing a long book instead of a short paper on the complete history of process philosophy, I would also include others. Philosophy, since it began, has always been overshadowed by philosophers philosophizing about things, the ontic move. Things are discrete entities. They do not have to be materialistic. Things like in classic atomic theory, they can be non-material things as in Plato's forms. But the point is that things are examined as if they existed in vacuum. If their relationship to other things is noticed, the relationship is still considered secondary. The thing in itself is always considered as being primary. Process philosophy, on the other hand, considers relationships and changes as being more important than the things, especially since the things are changing all the time anyway. It is appropriate for me to skip over the history and concentrate on modern ideas. One of the reasons for that is Heisenberg's uncertainty principle that tells us that we can never both know the momentum and the localization of whatever we are examining or trying to examine. The examiner cannot help but be a part of what is examined. The experiments with shooting photons through small holes has shown us that if you experiment to see if they are particles, they will act like particles. But if you experiment to see if they are waves, then they act like waves. The older metaphysical and ontological theories were always problematic, since by concentrating on discrete things, they could never explain how material things could interact with non-material things. By ignoring the ontology of both kinds of things, process philosophy discovers a whole new reality wherein the distinction between the material and the non-material is not a meaningful factor. Try this thought experiment. If a subatomic particle can be both a particle and a wave, then why cannot minds, thought and neural networks be given the same ontological reality as tables, chairs and motorcycles? Isn't everything made up of subatomic particles? Isn't everything both material and non-material?
Ja, nej, det är okej. Det stämmer. Tack, Kalle.
Okej.
Bra, du
Okej, nu såg jag det. Okej, så.
Du behöver inte göra något. Det är klart.
Play. Okay.
Nej, det är klart.
Aha, okay.
Heisenberg also gave us the clue that ontology and epistemology cannot be separated. That's very interesting. And process philosophy, using that clue, discovers new realities. Reality is what we know, and reality changes when we change what we know. In the old reality is things, paradigm, that would sound like a metaphysical mysticism, eller hur? But by using process philosophy for our epistemology, we can discover new realities and still call ourselves respectable empiricists. Let's start with psychology. George Kelly, 1905 to 66, developed the theory of personal constructs, explaining how we are all theoretical scientists, constructing and then acting upon our own realities. Kelly's theory of personal psychological construct is one of many good ways to both explain and demonstrate how processes work to become reality. According to Kelly, to state this faith as a philosophical premise, whatever exists can be reconstructed. This is to say that none of today's constructions, which are, of course, our only means of portraying reality, is perfect, and as the history of human thought repeatedly suggests, none is final. But for me to say, says Kelly, that whatever exists can be reconstructed is by no manner of means to say that it makes no difference how it's constructed. Quite the contrary. It often makes a world of difference. Some reconstructions may open fresh channels for a rich and productive life. Others may offer no alternative save suicide. Alfred North Whitehead is considered to be the main guy for process philosophy. In his book Process and Reality, an essay in cosmology, is where a longer research paper would begin. On speculative thought, a shorter essay, I will start. Here he explains the symbiotic relationship between theoretical science and empirical science. They are both necessary, each to keep the other honest. The proper satisfaction, says Whitehead, to be derived from speculative thought is elucidation. It is for this reason that fact is supreme over thought. This supremacy is the basis of authority. We scan the world to find evidence for elucidatory power. There is good reason why we have rules and procedures governing the scientific method, and why we make a distinction between science and pseudoscience. Dreaming about unicorns does not count as theoretical science, but speculative thought about empirical evidence does. What looks like stability is a relatively slow process of atrophied decay, something that Whitehead came to the conclusion already after the event of quantum mechanics in 1929. Very apt. Whitehead's statement about atrophied decay is the spirit and tradition of Heraclitus. But modern process philosophers have a more optimistic take on the process of inevitable and constant change. Since thinking is a process that interacts with the physical processes, random processes can be redirected to teleological processes toward deliberate and positive progress. William James used that optimism in psychology. John Dewey used that optimism in education. Considering especially what Whitehead meant by empirical science, you can see any thinking about science is bound to be a sort of thought experiment. A thought experiment that doesn't have to conclude anything nor establish anything. And this is the next paragraph. Pragmatism. This is what pragmatism is about. William James thinks that pragmatism is important in the process of epistemology. He writes, "This seems to be an excellent place for applying the pragmatic method. When a dispute arises, that method consists in auguring what practical consequences will be different if one side rather than the other were true. If no difference can be thought of, the dispute is quarrel over words. Historically, the two dominant philosophical methods overshadowing process philosophy and that pragmatism is trying to reconcile are, first, idealism/rationalism, which thinks of things as being immaterial, and the second one is materialism/empiricism, which thinks of things as being material. And I have to add here, both these divergent strands, they both stem from the Ionian philosophers of nature. To me, it's never become clearer. But if we have experiences that include both, the article author continues, how do we know which one is real? Using the pragmatic method, we would figure out which one works best for our survival. Yes, it's true that some people are perfectly safe in believing in ghosts, but it's equally safe not to believe in ghosts. What sort of cash value can we find in a certain approach or a certain statement? In here, John Dewey writes, the nature of experience can be understood only by noting that it includes an active and a passive element peculiarly combined. On the active hand, experience is a trying a meaning, which is made explicit in the connected term experiment. On the passive, it is undergoing. When we experience something, we act upon it. We do something with it, then we suffer or undergo the consequences. We do something to the thing, and then it does something to us in return. Such is the peculiar combination. And I might add here, obviously, Alice and Bob's experiment, where they get noted by their respective friends. Alice's friend, Bob's friend. That is a process. Why is it so? Well, tossing of a coin is a doing. All quantum mechanical experiments are doings. Whereas in classical physics, they are statements that are static. There is a stop in classical physics. You sort of put your foot down and you tell within the coordinate system what exists at a certain moment called t. Thereby you can stop time. Very convenient if you want to build a bridge, but not a very convenient way of looking at the world. Actually, it's quite false. Here we have a different pragmatistic outlook from a fellow called B.F. Skinner, a famous psychologist. Two conclusions are important for education. One, experience is primarily an active-passive affair. It is not primarily cognitive. Two, the measure of the value of experience lies in the perception of relationship or continuities to which it leads up. Acting and thinking, a physical process and a mental process, combine to create another process called experience. That could also be replaced by experiment. Dewey's explanation of experience as being a process that involves the interaction between doing, physically so to speak, and thinking, cognitively, also shows up in the problems that result from accepting the mind-body split of Descartes and others. For one thing, according to Dewey, people tend to ignore physical necessities when thinking about thinking. For another thing, they tend to treat physical activities as mechanical, ignoring the important relationship between doing and thinking. And the third problem is the emphasis on things, rather than on the relationship between things. Down that road lies reductionism, where you have the Parmenian staticness. Everything is in standstill. I think that reductionism is what prevents some philosophers from understanding how a subject can be the object of itself. Something we mentioned in the previous lecture, when reflective upon the subject becomes an object. You can't put a box inside itself, they might say, but I say you can put a mind inside itself, and that is just what self-consciousness is. A reductionist might not be able to understand how something physical like the body can interact with something non-physical like the mind, and thus declare that there is no such thing as a mind, or there is no such thing as consciousness. But those are just names for processes, and going beyond Dewey, some modern neuroscientists agree that we think not just with a part of our brain or something in the brain called the mind, but with our whole bodies, a whole Klein bottle, so to speak. To that I could say that the term mind could refer to the total process. Now I'll examine what William James says about the different kinds of experiences. Now we get to radical empiricism. A world of pure experience, in that James writes, to be radical, and empiricism must neither admit into its constructions any element that is not directly experienced, nor exclude from them any element that is directly experienced. For such a philosophy, the relations that connect experiences must themselves be experienced relations, and any kind of relation experience must be accounted as real as anything else in the system. That is, we do not have to be either strict materialists or strict idealists, and we certainly do not have to make up extra concept to justify deciding whether an experience counts as a physical or a mental experience. He then goes to discuss the difference between conjunctive and disjunctive relations, and he describes different levels of intimacy that relations have. While radical empiricism accepts all direct experience as real, James emphasizes that the most important distinction among various kinds of experiences is that within each of our personal histories, subject, object, interest, and purpose are continuous. Personal histories are processes of change in time, and the change itself is one of the things immediately experienced. And I think that is very close to when we speak about the modus of the observer in a quantum experiment, or in the quantum collapse of superposition or Stimmung. Change in this case means continuous as opposed to discontinuous transition. But continuous transition is one sort of conjunctive relationship, that means put together. And to be a radical empiricist means to hold fast to this conjunctive relation of all others. For this is the strategic point, the position through which, if a whole be made, all the corruptions of dialectics and all the metaphysical fictions pour into our philosophy. What James is saying, in my construct of radical empiricism and using quantum mechanics as a metaphor, is that experiences are in wave mode as opposed to particle mode. And as such, they are not discrete entities, but exist along a continuum like the frequencies of electromagnetic waves. On the surface, it seems like Dewey is disagreeing with James about the continuity of experiences. But James said in his definition of pragmatism, that it is only a quarrel over words. First, according to the pragmatic method, if a thing can be both material and non-material, then there is no cash value in quibbling over what you call it. Second, Dewey has a good explanation about why our experiences can be felt as broken up in discrete entities, even though they may actually all run together. Dewey says, life is no uniform, uninterrupted march or flow. It is a thing of histories, each with its own plot, its own inception and movement towards its close. I don't think he's actually denying the continuity of experiences. I think that his psychological construct finds cash value in noticing the different experiences and defining them by their beginnings, middles and ends, and like a series of narratives, then calling each one a separate thing. Using the quantum mechanics metaphor again, it is up to the experimenter to decide whether an object is a wave or a particle, depending upon his or her own, and very important, psychological construct, his or her makeup, what he or she has experienced, or as I would say, what she or he is, he or she's ontological status, their Sein. We are all constantly confronted with continuums that would drive us crazy if we didn't divide them up in discrete entities as a practical way of dealing with them. But those divisions are arbitrary and not natural divisions. We create them by our psychological constructs. I have always maintained the minds are like snowflakes. No two are alike. To explain why there are so many different psychological constructs about reality. But in actual fact, no individual neural network is ever configured exactly the same way at any given point in time. So as Heraclitus might have put it, we are never the same person from one moment to the next. Of course, we try to maintain some consistency to preserve our sense of self, and we mostly succeed. But I think that this plasticity is a good thing, and more use should be made of it. Paul Churchland writes in a reply to Fodor, talks about the value of being able to change our view of reality. He writes, we may begin to become such mutants or aliens ourselves when we change our sensory modalities by augmenting them with unusual instruments, such as phase contrast microphones, deep sky telescopes, long baseline stethoscopes, and so forth. And the metamorphosis is complete when after years of professional or amateur practice, we learn to see the world appropriately and efficiently with these new senses. But I'm remembering Whitehead's essay on the relationship between theoretical sciences and empirical science. Reductionists do have something to offer us, even if it is nothing more than a bunch of random empirical data for theoretical scientists to play mind games with. No stability, just progress. I, however, envision a new generation of speculative thinkers training themselves to see everything as a continuum and playing with novel ways of dividing up the continuum into separate discrete parts. Anything can be perceived as being either a wave or a particle, and the thought experiments would be designed to find out which quantum mode has the most cash value at any given time or place. An example. Normally, when someone tells jokes, they tell them one at a time as separate discrete entities, so that the listeners can tell which joke is which. The first paragraph contains several jokes, but they were a continuum and depended on their relationship to each other, a demonstration how our cognitive process works, as well as a partiture of a concert. It can be divided, but it is to be listened to as a whole. What the reader reads is sensory input, but the reader's mind already contains others' ideas from previous experience, which, as William James said, are all continuous, at least with the same individual, and those previous experiences combined with new sensory input will determine what kind of psychological construct about reality that any individual has at any given time or place. For all of the jokes to work, the reader must have previous experiences with Schrödinger, Leibniz, Voltaire, Terry Southern, Socrates, Plato, and the Patriot Act. My neural network is not configured now in the same way as it was before I started writing the paper, and it now contains new ideas for other papers to write. My next cognitive process will be to figure out how to divide all the new experience into discrete modules so that I can deal with them efficiently. Though essentially an anti-Heraclitean approach, our attention will be focused on the physical and often substantially cosmological side of Heraclitean thought. We will try to correlate it with modern physics and its problematic issues. Let's start with Erwin Schrödinger, who argues that Heraclitean physical philosophy doesn't provide any important physical aspect. Werner Heisenberg, also a Nobel laureate for physics, famously notices that modern physics is conceptually very close to Heraclitean thought, and the reference to the cosmic importance of the Heraclitean fire, which Heisenberg identifies with the contemporary concept of energy. Oh, very interesting. It must be surely noticed that the fragmented approach to the philosopher's thought, a one-sided insight, constitutes a sacrilegious fragmentation of Heraclitus, unifying logos. It is an act fundamentally opposed to the philosopher's thought, as it is characteristically mentioned by Axylus, an arbitrary partitioning of his thought in physics, theology, and politics is surely no Heraclitean at all. Such a particular approach, focused on the physical and essentially cosmological, will be presented in this paper, and we will try to connect it with modern physics. I wonder what would Heraclitus have to say today concerning the issues and deadlocks of modern physics. It is the answer to this capital question that we aim at, using the methodological paradigm of other philosophers like William James and Dewey. So let us begin, presenting briefly what I deplore about today's about the microphysics. We briefly mention 1. the particle-wave dualism problem, and naturally all the problems of the objectivity of the microphysical systems. Problems that could be summarized using the capital question, what is the reality? 2. The monistic problem and the aim for unifying monistic theory in modern physics. 3. The mutual interactions and transformation of all states in microphysics, and the problem of symmetries and breaking symmetries. 4. I would say even more important, the causality problem and determinism, in contrast to randomness and indeterminism. All these problems of modern physics could be even more briefly expressed using the keywords symmetry, broken symmetry, harmony and unity of opposites, change, eternal movement, becoming, monism, pluralism, scientific realism, law necessity, determinism, indeterminism. So let's hear what the great Ephesian has to say. All is divided and undivided, born and unborn, mortal and immortal, logos and time, father and son, God and right, hearing, not me, but logos. We must admit that it is wise to consider that all is one. And also, next fragment, conceive all and not all, converged, diverged, being in harmony and not being in harmony, and from all the one, and from one all. And I have to mention in parentheses here, converge, diverge, I think about chaos theory as laid up of Benoit Mandelbrot. There you have convergence and divergence. There you have the constructs of the galaxies, made only of differences. No galaxy would exist without differences. No galaxy would exist without death and life. But galaxies are greater than death and life. They are, in a way, eternal, not dependent on the material substance of them. There is one odd thing. Actually, one could say that the galaxies are older than the planets planets and stars that they contain. Concerning the relation of opposites to harmony, the Ephesian philosopher characteristically and comprehensively argues, the adverse directions converse, and from the differences the best harmony. And also, the hidden harmony is stronger than the evident. Very true. Very, very true. I think very good philosophers, and I would say even more so, good politicians like Winston Churchill, who never uttered the most important. He would never do such. By not being clear, by hiding the most important, like in his famous speech, we shall fight them on the streets, we shall fight them on the beaches. He hides defense, thereby making it 100 times more strong. A thought that directly refers to the harmonic unity of opposite states, which are involved as obvious or unrevealed symmetries, or even broken symmetries in the changes and the becoming in microphysics. The unity of opposites, causality and natural law necessity, the cosmic becoming, and the infinity of the universe are also keywords that connect Heraclitus' thought with modern physics. So, what does our philosopher tell us about the eternal becoming in the universe and about the deterministic law necessity. The cosmic order, which is the same for all, none of the gods nor of man has made, but it is always was, and is, and shall be, an ever existing fire, being kindled in measures, and being, very important, extinguished in measures. The ever existing fire that is kindled in measures and is extinguished in measures is the eternal fire that deterministically directs everything, and everything is guided by thunder, meaning with thunder the eternal fire. It is the cause, the driving force for a becoming based on collision and necessity. And once more, the galaxy is not made of its particles. It is greater than the fragmentization, the life and death inside the galaxy. But if you get stuck into the life inside the galaxy, we will lose the galaxy. And think of life and God and the soul as those things. The same time you point them out, you make them clear, you put them into the front, they disappear, they get dissolved, they get nullified, as Rudolf Gachet would have it. This is why I would say the soul has disappeared today, because it's too grand a thing to point out, to make it an object. Because objects are also always determined by its opposites, thereby nullified. And thereby we don't have a galaxy, and we don't have a soul, and we don't have a God. A God made into an existence is no God. Whereas an atheism based on non-existence, I would actually say, is not even an atheism. Doesn't serve the purpose even of atheism. So it goes both ways. We must consider war as universal, another phrase, and that's maybe one of the most important. That justice is a struggle, and that all happens due to struggle and necessity. Fragment 80, very important. In an eternal game, closure and disclosure, uncertainty and certainty, forgetfulness and truth, obvious harmony, or even invisible nature, that according to Heraclitus likes to remain hidden, is playing with us hide and seek. This eternal cosmic game, the wholeness of becoming, is what our philosopher tried to conceive with his dialectical thought, with his great unifying philosophy, Panta and I, underlying the capital significance of the unity of opposites in the eternal cosmic becoming, and establishing this unity as the fundamental and major element of his philosophy. Let's delve into modern physics. Through an intuitive view of the world, entirely anti-scientific, according to the positivistic and neo-positivistic ways of thinking, the efficient thought filters into it as its essence, providing with a theory of opposites, a guideline, a methodological paradigm towards the understanding of physical phenomena, exceeding unproductive dualisms like monism, pluralism, concord, discord, etc., passes with its fruitful thought, which is not entirely irrelevant to experience, from the knowledge of becoming to its holistic approach. The particle symmetries and the broken symmetries in microphysics, or the matter and antimatter issues, constitute characteristics examples of the unity of opposite states of matter and its different building blocks. Moreover, the study of the symmetries has also led to the prediction of the existence of new elementary particles and their characteristics. Conceive particle and wave, electron, positron, matter and atom, antimatter, determinism and indeterminism, confessing that it is wise to assume that all is one, and that from all the one, and from one all. Such an answer, which is not arbitrarily a sacrilegious adaptation of Heraclitus' philosophy, but rather its effortless continuation to our times. It seems also to agree, at least regarding the particle-wave dualism, with Bohr's complementary principle. According to Heraclitus, the unity of being and not being consists the truth of cosmos and the essence of becoming. This theory that reminds us of the more systematically structured but perhaps less dynamic Pythagorean table of opposites was the model of Hegel's philosophy, who tried with his dialectic to combine the opposites. According to Heraclitus, the unity of being and not being consists the truth of cosmos and the essence of becoming. This theory reminds us of the more systematically structured but perhaps less dynamic Pythagorean table of opposites. And here I need to restate, of course, maybe a false understanding of Hegel, as Kalle pointed out, but still it serves as a sort of cast or a simple map of how we usually understand reality these days, when we haven't understood the Heraclitean wholeness theory of opposition. There can be no wholeness without oppositions, and if the contradictions become one in the sense of adding 1 plus 1, both wholeness and particularity disappears. This is the dissolvement of the soul into water, but it's also, as the author of the article says, this is reductionism. Then you always go into the direction of Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, Churchland, as was mentioned in the article, or why not Chalmers? Yes, I'm sorry, Chalmers, I don't agree with you anymore. Your take is a compromise between realism, reductionism, and a sort of idealism, but it seems saying the same stuff. Heraclitus goes beyond that, and he's the only one, I would say. And I will also conclude in my summary here that Heraclitus could be the only one that, in a very subtle but still clear way, in a very hidden manner but still absolutely forceful, shows that modern physics can be understood as a process of opposites. A process that gives up and founds both what is static, that is realism, materialism, and what is unstatic, what is idealism. Both together make up the whole, but they need to be kept separate, like subject and object. And thereby I conclude the lecture, and I'm off to my next go. Thank you very much.
Thank you.